You know, folks today talk about inclusion and acceptance, but sometimes I wonder if we've forgotten what real community looks like. When someone's different, whether they can't hear, can't speak, or just don't fit society's mold, we tend to look the other way. But back in 1883, in the timber country of Oregon, one man discovered that our greatest treasures are often the people everyone else has thrown away. The morning mist clung to them Douglas firs like smoke from a dying cook fire. James Whitmore urged his gelding through the timber, surveying his newest timber holdings, 3,000 acres of prime Oregon lumber. His leather-bound ledger showed promising figures. The smell of pine resin filled the crisp air. Then he saw Millfield Station. The depot had been abandoned 2 years back, rails pulled up, windows boarded shut, but someone sat on that broken platform bench. A woman, still as death, head bent over needlework. James's horse snorted, stamping nervously in the frost-brittle leaves. The woman never looked up. Her hands moved with steady purpose, darning what looked like a child's torn coat. "Miss," James called out. She didn't respond, didn't even glance his direction. Something wasn't right here. Before we continue, please leave a like and subscribe. Let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. James dismounted 20 feet away. His boots crunched through frost-brittle leaves. The woman's needle never paused, steady, precise stitches through worn fabric. "Miss, are you hurt?" "Nothing." Her shoulders hunched deeper into a threadbare shawl. James stepped closer. The smell hit him unwashed wool, cold sweat, something sour like fear. Her fingers worked with desperate speed, pulling thread through cloth worn thin as paper. He pulled out his surveying notebook, tore a clean page, wrote with his pencil. "Are you hurt?" The woman's head snapped up, eyes wide, startled blue. She stared at the paper, then at his face. Her lips moved without sound. She shook her head, pointed to her ears, shook her head again. James's chest tightened. He wrote, "Name." She took his pencil with trembling fingers. Her script came careful. Neat Sarah Kellerman. Been here 3 days. Nowhere left to go. The morning wind cut through his wool coat. 3 days in this cold would kill a man. James wrote. What happened? Sarah's knuckles went white around the pencil. The words came slower. Portland family let me go. Said I brought shame. Could not hear their guests proper. Her eyes never left his face while he read. Watching for disgust. For dismissal. The smell of pine resin mixed with wood smoke from distant cook fires. James's timber operation lay 15 miles north. 200 men who needed meals cooked. Clothes mended, someone to tend their cuts and bruises. He wrote, I run a timber business. Need help with mending, cooking, fair wages. Sarah's breath caught. She read the words twice. Wrote back, Why help me? James studied her face. Dirt streaked her cheeks, but her chin stayed level. Proud. The mending in her lap showed stitches so fine they were nearly invisible work that would shame Portland seamstresses. He wrote, Good work deserves good wages. Sarah folded the torn coat, placed it carefully in a carpet bag that had seen better decades. She stood on unsteady legs, swayed once, caught herself against the depot wall. James offered his arm. She hesitated, then accepted, as James helped her mount his spare horse. He noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh bruises ringed her wrists, purple-black fingerprints, clear as a brand. The Portland family hadn't just dismissed her, they'd hurt her. But Sarah wasn't watching the trail ahead. Her gaze fixed on something behind them, hoofbeats approaching fast through the timber. Someone was following them. The rider turned out to be a mail carrier. Leather saddlebags heavy with letters for distant settlements. He tipped his hat and disappeared into the timber. Sarah's shoulders dropped half an inch. James led them through towering Douglas firs, their horses picking careful paths between massive trunks. Sarah's eyes widened at trees that would take 6 men holding hands to circle. The forest floor lay thick with rust-colored needles that muffled their horses' hooves. The scent of pine resin mixed with the distant smell of wood smoke and bacon grease. They crested a rise, and Whitmore's timber operation spread below like a small town. Bunkhouses lined neat rows. A cookhouse sent steam from 3 chimneys. Men swarmed everywhere hauling logs, sharpening cross-cut saws, feeding steam engines that belched black smoke into the crisp air. 200 workers, James said aloud, then caught himself. He wrote it in his notebook. Sarah stared. Her lips formed the words 200 without sound. Bill Henderson, the foreman, strode over as they dismounted. His weathered face creased into a frown. Boss, we're not running a charity house. We're not running a prison either. Bill, James helped Sarah down. Miss Kellerman will handle mending and assist Cookie. Henderson's eyes took in Sarah's worn dress, her carpet bag, the way she avoided looking at his moving lips. Another mouth means less grub for the men. Cookie Jackson emerged from the cookhouse, flour dusting his leather apron, missing 2 front teeth. He grinned at Sarah. Can you make decent biscuits, lady? Sarah nodded quickly. Then you're hired. Cookie wiped flour-caked hands on his apron. These boys tear everything they own, need someone with steady fingers. Sarah's quarters turned out to be a clean storage room behind the cookhouse. A narrow cot, washstand, hooks for hanging clothes. The smell of bacon grease and coffee beans clung to the wooden walls. Through the single window, she could see men washing at outdoor basins, preparing for the next day's work. The steam whistle shrieked at 5 o'clock the next morning. Sarah jolted awake as boots thundered past her door. Men poured from bunkhouses, pulling on red flannel shirts and wool trousers, grabbing tin coffee cups, the busy-as-a-beehive movement of 200 bodies heading to work. Sarah dressed quickly and found Cookie already frying salt pork by the dozen. Smoke rose from the cast-iron cook stove, mixing with the steam from boiling coffee. He pointed to a basket of torn clothing beside the kitchen door. Work shirts with ripped seams, trousers with holes worn through the knees, long johns darned so many times they looked like patchwork quilts. She picked up Tom Bradley's blue work shirt. The sleeve had torn clean away from the shoulder seam. Sarah examined the damage, selected thread that matched perfectly, and began to work. Her needle moved with steady purpose. Under, over, under, over. Each stitch exactly 1/8 inch apart. She rebuilt the seam stronger than the original, reinforcing stress points with tiny cross stitches invisible from the outside. Bradley returned at noon, sweaty and covered in sawdust. Cookie handed him the shirt. Bradley held it up, turned it over, squinted at the shoulder. "Ma'am, where's the tear?" Sarah pointed to where it had been. Bradley ran his thumb along the seam, feeling for the repair. Nothing, no ridge, no thick spot, no sign of damage ever existing. "You've got magic in them fingers," Sarah wrote on her slate. He said something nice, James, who'd been watching from the cookhouse doorway. Approached. He said you're gifted. Sarah wrote, "First compliment in 2 years." 3 more men appeared with torn clothing, a ripped trouser knee, a shirt collar pulled loose from too rough washing, work gloves split at the palm where axe handles had worn through. Sarah nodded, accepted each piece, added them to her growing pile. By evening, word had spread through the camp like smoke from a green wood fire. A line formed outside the cookhouse. Men clutched damaged clothing, caps in hand, speaking slowly so Sarah could watch their lips move. She nodded to each, examined their torn garments, estimated repair time with silent gestures. The smell of beef stew drifted from Cookie's kitchen. Men gathered around the long plank tables, talking in low voices about the day's timber cutting. Crosscut saws hung on pegs along the cookhouse walls. Cork-soled boots lined up outside the door, thick with sawdust and bark. James found his surveying jacket hanging on his cabin door after supper. Yesterday, brambles had torn the sleeve near the elbow, a 3-inch gash that had ruined good wool fabric. Tonight, the jacket looked untouched. He ran his finger along where the tear should be. Nothing. The weave lay perfect, unbroken, as if the damage had never happened, inside his cabin. James lit the whale oil lamp. The glass chimney threw steady light across his wooden table. He pulled out paper and pen. Wrote, "How did you learn to sew like that?" Sarah entered when he knocked on her door. She read his question, wrote back on her slate. Had to be useful somewhere. Always wanted to learn lip reading? James studied her careful script. The lamplight caught gold threads in her brown hair. He wrote, always wanted to cut trees without destroying the forest. Sarah tilted her head, questioning. James wrote, most timber operations strip everything bare. Want to leave something for my children's children? Sarah's eyes lingered on the word children. She wrote, you have children. Not yet. Someday. Sarah folded her hands in her lap. The oil lamp flickered in a draft from the cabin's chinking. She wrote, what kind of woman would marry a timber baron? James hesitated, pen hovering over paper. The question felt loaded with meaning he couldn't decode. He wrote, one who sees past the money to the man underneath. Sarah read his words twice. Her fingers worried the edge of her sleeve, finding a loose thread and smoothing it down. She reached for the pen, but before she could write, heavy boots pounded up the cabin steps. Someone hammered on James's door with urgent fists. Boss, Henderson's voice, sharp with alarm. Ryder just brought mail from Portland. Official letters with fancy seals. You need to see this right now. Through the window, Sarah saw lamplight catch on expensive letterhead and red wax seals. Her face went chalk white. They'd found her. Henderson's urgent knocking shattered the cabin's quiet. James opened the door. The foreman thrust 3 letters forward, all bearing Portland postmarks and red wax seals that gleamed like blood in the lamplight. Mail rider says they're important. Boss, came special delivery. James took the letters. Sarah's knuckles went white against her skirt fabric. The expensive paper crackled as James broke the first seal. His eyes scanned the formal script. Black ink on cream paper. Whitmore Lumber Enterprises. We understand you have employed Sarah Kellerman, recently dismissed from the Morrison household. We wish to inform you of her unsuitable character. James folded the letter without finishing, fed it directly into his fireplace. The flames consumed the Portland letterhead in seconds, curling the paper into ash. He burned the other 2 letters unopened, their wax seals bubbling in the heat. Sarah stared at the dancing flames. Her shoulders dropped half an inch. James pulled out his notebook. Wrote, "Your past stays buried here." Sarah's lips trembled. She wrote back, "Thank you." Henderson shifted his weight on the porch. "Boss, was it something important? Nothing that concerns us. Bill, get some rest." The foreman left, his boots heavy on wooden steps. James closed the door, turned the iron key in the lock. Sarah's breathing had steadied, color returning to her pale cheeks. The smell of wood smoke filled the cabin. Outside, the last voices faded as men settled into their bunkhouses for the night. 3 days later, the camp had absorbed Sarah like dry wood soaking up rain. She moved through the cookhouse with quiet efficiency, mending clothes between meals, learning each worker's schedule by watching their habits. The first hand signal happened by accident. Cookie had prepared his beef stew enough to feed 200 hungry timbermen. The cast-iron pot sat too hot to approach, steam rising in dangerous clouds that could scald a man's face. Sarah needed to signal the men that grub was ready, but shouting was useless to her. She stepped into the cookhouse doorway, raised both arms high above her head, waved them slow and deliberate, like flagging down a distant train. Conversation stopped. Every man in the camp yard turned toward her. Sarah pointed to the cookhouse, then made eating motions with her hands, lifting an invisible spoon to her mouth. "Hot stew ready," Cookie hollered, though it wasn't necessary. The men were already moving, boots clattering against wooden planks. Tom Bradley grinned at Sarah as he passed, cap in his hand. "Ma'am, that's the clearest dinner bell we ever had." Sarah wrote on her slate. "He said something nice." James translated. "He said you're the best signal giver in camp." Sarah wrote, "What's signal giver?" The next morning, Sarah used a different gesture. She cupped her hands around her mouth, then pointed to the coffee pot bubbling on Cookie's stove. "Fresh coffee brewing," Cookie announced. By the third day, Sarah had developed a whole vocabulary with her hands. Flat palm pushed forward. Stop what you're doing. Finger pointing down, urgent like danger below your feet. Both hands moving in circles. Keep working. Thumbs up. Good job, boys. The men caught on faster than green wood catching fire. When young Tommy Mueller nearly stepped into a coiled cable near the steam donkey engine, Sarah's urgent pointing saved him from a broken leg. Tommy looked where she indicated, saw the hazard, jumped back quick as a cat. "Miss Sarah sees everything," he told the others that evening. Voice full of admiration. Tommy was 17, barely grown, with eager eyes and hands already calloused from timber work. He approached Sarah during the supper cleanup, cap in his hands. "Miss Sarah, could you teach me more of them hand signals?" Sarah tilted her head, questioning. Tommy pointed to his own hands, then to hers, made clumsy gestures, trying to copy her earlier signals like a child learning to write letters. Sarah smiled the first real smile James had seen from her since that morning at the depot. She took Tommy's rough hands, positioned his fingers careful-like, showed him the sign for "thank you" fingertips, touching his chin, then moving outward toward the person he was thanking. Tommy practiced the motion 3 times, tongue poking out the corner of his mouth in concentration. "Like this?" Sarah nodded. Tommy's grin could have lit the whole cookhouse. "Boys, come see what Miss Sarah's teaching me." Within an hour, 8 men had gathered around Sarah's table. She showed them basic signs. Hello. Please. Thank you. Good. Bad. Careful. Her movements were neat and purposeful, patient as a schoolmarm. She guided rough, work-hardened hands into proper positions, corrected mistakes with gentle touches. James watched from the cookhouse doorway. Sarah's intelligence blazed in her animated face. These weren't random gestures. She was building a real language, systematic as reading and writing. That evening, James knocked on Sarah's door. She opened it, still wearing her work apron that smelled of lye soap and wood smoke. James held up his notebook. "Can you teach me the hand alphabet?" Sarah's eyes widened like she'd been offered gold nuggets. She nodded quick, gestured him inside. The storage room felt smaller with both of them in it. Sarah lit her single oil lamp, pulled out a McGuffey reader someone had donated to the camp. She opened to a page with large alphabet letters printed clear and black. "A," she mouthed without sound, forming her hand into a fist with the thumb stuck out to the side. James copied the position. His fingers felt thick as sausages. Clumsy. Sarah shook her head, adjusted his thumb angle with her cool fingers. "B." Her hand flattened, fingers pressed together, thumb folded across the palm. James tried again. Sarah's hands guided his into the correct shape. Her touch light, but sure. They worked through the entire alphabet. C, D, E, F. James's knuckles ached from the unfamiliar positions. His ring finger wouldn't cooperate, for the letter R kept sticking out when it should fold down. Sarah patiently corrected him, over and over, never showing irritation. The oil lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. Outside, someone was playing a mouth harp, a lonesome tune that drifted through the camp like smoke. "Now try spelling your name," she mouthed, her lips moving careful and clear. J-A-M-E-S. James formed each letter slow, concentrating on finger positions like he was handling delicate machinery. Sarah watched carefully, nodding at each correct letter. "Good," she mouthed. James wrote on his paper, "Now spell yours." Sarah's hands moved smooth as water, S-A-R-A-H. Each letter flowed into the next without pause, beautiful as watching a skilled carpenter work wood. James attempted to copy her. His fingers fumbled. A better R. That darn ring finger betrayed him again. A smoother now. H. His hand cramped from the effort. Sarah laughed without sound, her shoulders shaking. The joy was visible in every line of her body, lighting up her face like sunrise. James tried again, S-A-R-A-H. This time he managed all 5 letters without major mistakes. Sarah's face transformed. Not exactly a smile, something deeper. Recognition, connection. Like two people finding they speak the same language after thinking they were strangers. Their hands had moved closer during the lesson. Sarah's fingertips touched his wrist as she corrected his grip one more time. James felt the small calluses on her palms from years of needlework. She didn't pull away. The oil lamp sputtered in a draft. Outside, the mouth harp player finished his tune. Leaving the camp, wrapped in mountain silence, Sarah started to pull her hand back from the paper. James's fingers brushed hers as he reached for the pencil. The contact lasted maybe 2 seconds. Neither moved away immediate-like. Then boots pounded past Sarah's window. Someone shouted in alarm from the direction of the lumber mill. "Fire, fire in the sawdust pile. All hands to the mill." Through the window, they saw orange flames dancing against the night sky. James burst from Sarah's quarters, boots hitting the ground hard. Sarah followed, clutching her shawl against the night air. The smell of wood smoke thickened as they ran toward the commotion, not the sharp scent of burning timber, but the slower smell of smoldering sawdust. Men swarmed around the mill building like ants around spilled molasses. Buckets passed from hand to hand. Water splashed against glowing embers where a pile of accumulated sawdust had caught fire from a lightning strike. "Just the waste pile." "Boss," Henderson called out, his face streaked with soot. "Got it contained. Lightning must have hit during that last storm." James's chest loosened. Not the mill itself, just the sawdust heap that smoldered rather than blazed. Men stamped out the last sparks with their cork-soled boots, the smell of wet ash replacing the threat of real fire. But Sarah hadn't returned to her quarters. She stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the cleanup with sharp attention. Her eyes tracked the workers' movements like a hawk watching field mice. Tommy Mueller yelped, jerking his hand away from a burnt timber. Blood welled from a jagged gash across his palm where a splinter had torn deep. He sucked the wound, spat red. "Just a scratch," Tommy muttered, but his face had gone pale as milk. Sarah stepped forward quick as a striking snake. She caught Tommy's wrist, examined the cut in the lamplight. The gash was deeper than it looked, wood splinters embedded in torn flesh. Dirt ground into the wound. Sarah shook her head firm, pointed toward the cookhouse. "Miss Sarah wants you to come with her," James translated. "It's nothing, really." Sarah's grip tightened on Tommy's wrist. Her expression brooked no argument, stern as a school teacher. Tommy followed her to the cookhouse, 6 other men trailing behind like curious cattle. Sarah lit 2 coal oil lamps, illuminating Cookie's kitchen workspace. The smell of bacon grease and coffee beans hung thick in the air. She pumped water into a tin basin, gestured for Tommy to extend his hand. The cut was ugly, ragged edges, splinters driven deep, already starting to fester. Sarah opened Cookie's supply cabinet, found a brown bottle of carbolic acid. She poured the antiseptic over Tommy's wound without warning. He hissed through clenched teeth, sweat beading on his forehead. "Burns like the very dickens." Sarah ignored his complaint. She picked splinters from the cut with steady fingers, cleaned each fragment of dirt and bark. The carbolic acid turned the water pink with diluted blood. Her movements were sure and purposeful, not the first time she'd tended wounds. From her sewing kit, Sarah selected her finest needle. Thread followed white cotton, nearly invisible. Her stitches were tiny, precise, each one exactly the same size. 5 perfect sutures closed the wound like it had been sewn by a professional surgeon. Tommy stared at his bandaged hand, wrapped neat in clean flannel strips. "You done this before, Miss Sarah?" Sarah wrote on James's notebook, "Needle practice. Same skill, different fabric." Big Mike O'Sullivan pushed forward, extending his own massive hand. 3 fingers showed infected cuts from yesterday's work swollen. Red, pus forming around embedded dirt. "Miss, could you look at these?" Sarah examined Mike's wounds with the same careful attention. The infections had taken hold, angry red streaks climbing toward his wrist. She reached for the carbolic acid again, ignoring his wincing as she cleaned each cut thoroughly, one by one. The men presented injured hands, cuts ignored until they festered, burns treated with nothing but spit and prayer. Splinters worked so deep they'd gone septic from neglect. Sarah cleaned every wound, applied antiseptic despite their protests, bandaged the worst cuts with strips torn from clean flour sacks. "Lady knows more about doctorin' than most sawbones I ever seen," Cookie observed, watching Sarah work with professional skill. Sarah wrote another note. These happen because shirts tear, gloves wear thin, men work with bad equipment. James read her words aloud to the gathered men, nods around the kitchen, understanding dawning on weathered faces. She's right as rain, Henderson admitted, rolling up his sleeves to show similar scars. Half the injuries come from torn clothing catching on machinery. Sarah wrote again. Teach men to mend proper. Prevent problems instead of treating them after. Tommy raised his freshly bandaged hand. You mean like them sign lessons, but for fixing our gear? Sarah nodded, enthusiastic-like, her whole face lighting up with the idea. She wrote, Sewing circle. After supper tomorrow, men learn to repair their own clothes, make them last longer, work safer. The next evening, 23 men crowded into the cookhouse after their salt pork and beans. Sarah had arranged needles, thread, and cloth patches on the long plank table. Cookie cleared extra space, grumbling good-naturedly about the disruption to his domain. Never thought I'd be learning needlework, muttered Jack Brennan, a burly Irishman with hands like sledgehammers. My dear mother would laugh herself silly. And Sarah demonstrated basic stitches on a scrap of canvas. Running stitch for seams, quick, functional. Back stitch for strength where clothes got hard wear. Cross stitch for patching holes that might grow bigger. Her needle moved with mechanical precision, each stitch identical to the last. The men attempted to copy her movements. Thick fingers fumbled with fine thread like trying to pick up beans with mittens on, needles bent under clumsy pressure. More blood was drawn learning to sew than had been shed in the sawdust fire. Men pricking their fingers and cursing under their breath. But they kept at it, stubborn as mules. Tommy proved surprisingly handy, his young fingers adapting quick to the delicate work. Henderson, despite his gruff exterior, produced neat, serviceable stitches that would hold under hard use. Even Big Mike managed to darn a wool sock without creating more holes than he fixed. Beats paying the company store prices for new gear, Mike observed, examining his repair work in the lamplight. These stitches might outlast the rest of the sock, Sarah wrote on her slate. Next week, basic first aid. Clean wounds proper. Prevent blood poisoning. During the 3rd week, Sarah tackled the camp's biggest problem, boredom. 200 men, cut off from families and civilization, with nothing to occupy evening hours except drinking rot-gut whiskey and gambling away their wages. She approached James with a written proposal. Camp needs library. Men pool money for books, newspapers. Reading improves minds, prevents trouble. James studied her careful script. The idea made sense. Educated workers made better workers, and anything that kept the men from drinking themselves stupid was worth trying. You reckon the boys would support this idea? Sarah nodded firm, wrote, They want to better themselves. Just need opportunity. The next evening. Sarah stood before the assembled crew in the cookhouse. The smell of beef stew and fresh-baked cornbread filled the air. 200 men packed the space, sitting on benches and overturned crates, faces expectant in the lamplight. James positioned himself beside her, ready to translate her words. She began signing, her hands moving with fluid grace. James spoke her thoughts. Miss Sarah proposes we establish a camp library. Each man contributes 4 bits monthly. We purchase books, newspapers, reading materials. Murmurs rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Some skeptical, others interested. Men who could barely write their own names looked uncertain. Sarah continued signing. James translated. Reading improves job prospects. Better vocabulary means better wages when you leave here. Knowledge is an investment in your future. Tommy raised his work-calloused hand. What kind of books, Miss Sarah? Sarah's hands moved again, deliberate and clear. Technical manuals for machinery operation, agricultural guides for those wanting farms someday, medical texts for basic health care, adventure stories for entertainment during long winter evenings. Henderson crossed his arms, skeptical as a banker examining a loan application. 4 bits is half a day's wages for some men. Sarah nodded, signed her response. James translated. She understands the sacrifice, but ignorance costs more than education ever could. Big Mike stood up, his bulk blocking lamplight from the men behind him. I'm in. Been wanting to read about steam engine maintenance, maybe learn something useful. Me too, Tommy added, his young voice carrying over the crowd. Got a sweetheart back in Salem. Want to write her proper letters instead of scratching out words like a schoolboy. Hands began rising throughout the cookhouse. 20 men, 40. The movement spread like wildfire. Eventually, over 100 had volunteered contributions to the library fund. Cookie wiped his eyes with his flour-dusted apron. 30 years cooking for timber crews, never seen anything like this. Sarah reached into her own small leather purse, pulled out $2 silver. Her entire week's wages, everything she'd earned mending and cooking. She placed the coins on the table with a soft clink. First contribution, James announced. Though no translation was needed, every man understood the gesture. A collection hat appeared from somewhere. Coins clinked steadily as it passed from hand to hand, quarters, dimes, even some paper money from men who'd been saving for months. By evening's end, they'd raised $37, enough for a substantial book order from Portland, with money left over for newspaper subscriptions. Sarah wrote detailed instructions for James Webster's dictionary first, McGuffey readers for men learning letters, medical handbook, machinery repair guide, Portland Oregonian newspaper weekly subscription. The following week brought the camp's first social evening. Big Mike appeared with his fiddle, joined by Cookie's mouth harp and Henderson's surprisingly melodious baritone voice. The music filled the cookhouse with warmth, old songs from Ireland, Germany, places these men remembered as home. Sarah sat at the edge of the circle, watching faces in the firelight. Some looked younger than their years, homesickness softening hard features. Others seemed ancient despite being barely 30, worn down by dangerous work and isolation from family. Tommy approached with paper and pencil. Miss Sarah, could you teach us a song in sign language? Sarah considered the request. She'd learned hymns in the Portland church before her dismissal. Simple melodies with clear rhythm that could be signed as easily as sung. She stood, positioned herself where everyone could see, began signing Amazing Grace. Her movements synchronized to Big Mike's fiddle. The melody was familiar to every man present. But watching Sarah's hands tell the story gave it new meaning: lost, found, blind, seeing. Universal truths that needed no sound to convey their power. When the song ended, absolute silence filled the cookhouse. Then Tommy began clapping, his bandaged hand awkward but enthusiastic. Others joined until applause thundered through the building like rain on a tin roof. Sarah's cheeks flushed pink. She'd never performed for an audience before, never been the center of attention by choice. James wrote on his slate, You've given them something precious. Sarah wrote back. They gave it to me first. The evening continued with stories, more music, and men attempting to sign along with Sarah's hymns. Laughter replaced the usual evening complaints about aching backs and dangerous work. The cookhouse felt like a family gathering instead of a work camp mess hall. Henderson approached James during a quiet moment when the men were learning a new song. "Boss, that woman's changed everything here." "How so?" "Men take pride in their appearance now. Fix their clothes instead of wearing them to rags. They're reading during break time instead of gambling away their wages. 3 fights this month used to be 3 a week." James watched Sarah teaching sign language to a group of eager students. Her face glowed with purpose, animated in ways he'd never seen before. "She's found her calling," James murmured. "Question is," Henderson said quietly, "what happens when word gets back to Portland about what we're doing here? All this education and improvement, some folks won't like it." As if summoned by his words. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the evening music. A rider materialized from the darkness beyond the lamp's reach, saddlebags heavy with official mail. The mail carrier dismounted, handed James a thick envelope. Expensive paper. Portland postmark. Multiple official seals pressed deep into red wax. Sarah saw the envelope from across the cookhouse. Her face went pale as January snow. The return address read in elaborate script, "Morrison and Associates, Legal Counsel." James broke the seal with trembling fingers. The first line made his blood run cold. "We have been reliably informed of your continued employment of Sarah Kellerman, despite previous warnings regarding her unsuitable character." James's hands shook as he read the legal document in the flickering lamplight. The elegant script burned into his vision like a brand Mr. Whitmore. "We represent the Morrison household regarding Sarah Kellerman's dismissal for moral impropriety. Multiple witnesses attest to her inappropriate conduct with young Mr. Morrison. Her continued presence in your employ reflects poorly on your business reputation and moral standards. Immediate termination strongly recommended." The expensive paper crackled between James's fingers. The smell of fine ink and sealing wax filled his nostrils, the scent of Portland money and influence. Sarah watched from across the cookhouse, her face draining of color as she recognized the gilt-edged letterhead. James folded the letter careful-like, walked to the fireplace where evening embers still glowed red as angry eyes, fed the document to the flames without hesitation. The legal seal bubbled and blackened. Expensive paper curled, consumed itself in seconds. But the poison of those words hung in the air like smoke from green wood. The mail carrier hadn't finished his delivery. He pulled 3 more envelopes from his leather saddlebags, each one bearing Portland business addresses, all marked "Urgent" in red ink. "More for you. Mr. Whitmore, rider's been carrying these for 2 days straight. Must be mighty important." James accepted the letters with steady hands, though his stomach churned like butter in a churn. The return addresses made his blood run cold. Cascade Timber Investment Company, Oregon Lumber Association, Portland Banking Consortium. Sarah had moved closer, close enough to see the official seals pressed deep into red wax. Her breathing came quick and shallow, like a trapped rabbit. James opened the first envelope with his penknife. The message was brief, as a hangman's verdict. Contract termination, effective immediately, unless Sarah Kellerman removed from premises within 72 hours. Moral standards clause violation clearly established. Investors demand immediate compliance. The second letter contained similar ultimatums, written on paper so expensive it felt like cloth. 3 major investors, representing more than half of James's financing, demanded Sarah's removal like they were ordering supplies. The third envelope held the most damaging accusations woman seduced employer's son. Corrupted household morals through wanton behavior, history of improper conduct with married men, character references proven fabricated. Sarah's hands trembled against her skirt like aspen leaves in a storm. She'd read the letters over James's shoulder, her face growing paler with each vicious line. James crumpled all 3 letters in his fists, fed them to the fireplace one by one, watching Portland's threats turn to ash. But their words had already spread through the cookhouse like spilled poison. Tommy Muller approached hesitant-like, his young face creased with worry. "Boss, bad news from back east. Nothing that concerns you. Tommy, get back to your supper." But Tommy had seen Sarah's expression, the look of a deer hearing wolves howl. Word spread through the cookhouse like wildfire through dry grass. Men gathered in small groups, whispering, glancing toward James and Sarah with concern etched on weathered faces. Henderson materialized at James's elbow, solid as an oak tree. "Boss, what's the trouble?" James couldn't find his voice. His throat felt stuffed with cotton. Sarah stepped forward, took James's pencil with shaking fingers, wrote on his notebook, "Portland wants me gone. Will destroy James's business if I stay." Henderson read the words, his weathered face hardening like leather in the sun. "Who's making these threats?" Sarah wrote. "Investors, Lumber Association. Say I corrupted young man in Morrison House. All lies, but they believe what serves their purpose." Big Mike O'Sullivan pushed through the crowd, his massive frame blocking lamplight. "What's all this fuss about Miss Sarah?" Henderson showed him the notebook. Mike's face flushed red above his black beard, like a coal stove heating up. "Bunch of lying, no-account snake oil peddlers." More men pressed closer, drawn by the commotion. Cookie read Sarah's words aloud for those who couldn't make out her careful script. Angry mutters rippled through the gathering like thunder before a storm. "Miss Sarah never done nothing improper," Tommy declared, his voice cracking with indignation. "She's been nothing but helpful to every man in this camp. Taught me to read decent letters," added Jack Brennan, rolling up his sleeves like he meant business. "My Margaret's been writing me for months, first time I could write back proper instead of scratching marks like a child." Sarah's eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. She wrote another message, her hand trembling so hard the letters came out shaky. "Cannot let them destroy James's business. Will leave tonight before more damage done." "Like blazes you will," Big Mike growled, his Irish accent thickening with anger. Sarah shook her head desperate-like, wrote frantically, "You don't understand. These men control James's financing. Without their contracts, camp closes down. 200 jobs lost because of me." James found his voice, hoarse as a crow's call. "Sarah's right about one thing. They do hold the purse strings. Without their backing, this whole operation shuts down." "Boss," Henderson interrupted, his voice hard as iron. "How long we worked together?" 12 years. Bill, you know that. Ever know me to back down from a fair fight?" James met his foreman's eyes. "Saw steel there. Never once. Then don't expect me to start now over some Portland bullies." Henderson turned to face the assembled men, his voice carrying to every corner of the cookhouse. "Boys, we got ourselves a choice to make. Miss Sarah stays, and we risk losing fancy contracts from men who never held an axe in their lives, or we let Portland moneymen run our business for us." Tommy stepped forward without hesitation. "She stays." "Stays," echoed Cookie, wiping flour from his hands. "Darn right she stays," Big Mike added. his massive fist clenched, one by one. Every man in the cookhouse voiced support. The unanimous response thundered through the building like an avalanche, shaking dust from the rafters. Sarah stared at the crowd, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. She wrote with shaking hands, "You don't understand what you're risking." "We understand plenty," Henderson replied, his voice gentle now. "Understand you saved Tommy's hand from blood poisoning. Understand you taught half these boys to read and write decent. Understand you made this camp feel like home instead of just another work prison." James watched his crew rally around Sarah like soldiers protecting their flag. These men, hardened by years of dangerous work, scarred by falling trees and spinning saw blades, stood ready to sacrifice their livelihoods for one deaf woman who'd shown them human kindness. His throat tightened with emotion he hadn't felt since his father passed. Sarah shook her head desperately, like a horse refusing the bit. Wrote James, "You must choose your business. I cannot let my troubles destroy everything you built." "Your troubles?" James's voice cracked like a whip. "Sarah, what exactly happened in that Portland house?" Sarah's pencil hesitated over the paper like a bird afraid to land. Then she wrote the truth in careful, painful script. "Young Mr. Morrison cornered me in the pantry, tried to force himself on me. I fought him off. He told his parents I tempted him. They believed their son over a deaf servant girl. The cookhouse fell silent as a graveyard. Men's faces darkened with understanding, hands clenching into fists. Tommy's young voice cut through the quiet like a knife. "Lying coward blamed you for his own filthy behavior." Sarah nodded miserably. "Wrote his word against mine." Who would believe a deaf woman over a rich man's son, James, felt rage building in his chest like steam in a boiler? Not at Sarah, at the injustice of her situation. At Portland society that would destroy an innocent woman to protect a guilty man's reputation. He walked to his desk, pulled out good paper and his steel nib pen, began writing responses to Portland's ultimatums, his handwriting firm and clear. "Gentlemen, Miss Sarah Kellerman's character is beyond reproach. Your accusations are baseless slander designed to protect a scoundrel's reputation. My contracts may be terminated at your discretion. My employment decisions remain my own." Henderson read over James's shoulder, tobacco juice staining the corner of his mouth. "Boss, you certain about this? That's powerful lot of money to lose over principle." James continued writing, his pen scratching across expensive paper. "Furthermore, any man who would assault a defenseless woman and blame her for his crimes deserves neither protection nor respect. Consider this my final word on the matter." Sarah grabbed James's wrist, stopping his pen mid-word. Her eyes were wide with panic, like a cornered animal. She wrote urgently, "Don't sacrifice everything for me. I'm not worth destroying your life's work." James looked into her frightened face, saw the woman who'd transformed his rough camp from a workplace into a community, who'd taught his men dignity and pride through simple human decency, who'd brought reading and learning to workers society had written off as worthless laborers. He covered her trembling hand with his own. "Sarah, you're worth more than all their contracts put together." The men murmured agreement like amen in church. Cookie wiped his eyes with his flour-dusted sleeve. Leaving white streaks on his weathered cheeks, James sealed his letters with red wax, pressed his signet ring deep into the warm seal, handed them to the waiting mail carrier. "Deliver these tonight. Special delivery. They want an answer, they've got one." The mail carrier mounted his horse, leather creaking in the night air, disappeared into darkness beyond the camp's lamplight. Sarah sat heavily on a wooden crate, overwhelmed by the evening's events like a person caught in a flash flood. She wrote shakily, "What happens now?" James knelt beside her on one knee. "Now we find out what this camp is really made of." Henderson clapped James on the shoulder with a hand heavy as a hammer. "Boss, we've been talking while you were writing them letters. Boys took a vote." "What kind of vote?" "Unanimous decision. If Portland pulls their contracts, we'll work for whatever wages you can pay until you find new buyers. Every man agrees we stick together like family should." Sarah stared at the assembled faces. 200 men willing to risk their livelihoods for her sake. Faces glowing in the lamplight like a congregation at evening service. She wrote, "Why? Why would you do this for someone like me?" Tommy spoke for all of them, his young voice steady as bedrock. "Miss Sarah, you never asked us to be anything but decent human beings. Least we can do is return the favor." And the evening might have ended there, with fellowship and mutual support warming the cookhouse like a good fire. But boots pounded on the wooden steps outside. A breathless rider burst through the door, his horse still snorting from hard riding. "Mr. Whitmore, 3 men in a fancy black carriage just pulled up to the main gate. Expensive suits, city shoes. Say they're from the Portland Logging Association. Demand to speak with you immediately about moral standards." Sarah's face went chalk white as fresh snow. She stood on unsteady legs, swayed once like a sapling in strong wind. James caught her arm. "What is it?" Sarah wrote with trembling hands. "They've come to drag me back to Portland." Through the cookhouse windows, lamplight revealed an expensive black carriage flanked by 2 armed riders. Brass fittings gleamed like gold. Matched horses stamped nervously, their breath steaming in the cold air. The Portland delegation had arrived to collect their prize. 3 men in pressed wool suits stepped down from the black carriage like undertakers arriving for a funeral. Their boots clicked against the wooden planks of the camp platform with military precision. The leader, a thin man with steel-rimmed spectacles, carried a leather satchel and the bearing of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "Mr. Whitmore," his voice carried Portland authority like a judge pronouncing sentence. "I am Harrison Fletcher, representing the Oregon Logging Association. We need to discuss your employment situation." James stepped outside the cookhouse, the smell of wood smoke and bacon grease clinging to his clothes. Behind him, 200 men had gone silent as mourners at a graveside. The only sounds were crackling fireplace logs and someone's nervous breathing cutting through the mountain air. "Gentlemen, you've traveled a fair distance for a conversation that could have been handled by mail." Fletcher's pale eyes swept the assembled workers like he was counting cattle at auction. "Some matters require personal inspection. May we speak privately?" Sarah pressed herself against the cookhouse wall, trying to disappear into the shadows. Her hands shook so violently she had to clasp them behind her back to hide the trembling. "Anything you need to say can be said right here," James replied, his voice steady as bedrock. Fletcher opened his satchel, withdrew a thick document bound in legal ribbon. "Very well. By authority of the Oregon Logging Association and Portland Commercial Bank, we are here to conduct a moral fitness evaluation of this operation." Henderson spat tobacco juice into the dirt, the brown stream landing dangerously close to Fletcher's polished boots. "Moral fitness, what's that supposed to mean? Recent reports suggest this camp employs individuals of questionable character. Specifically," Fletcher's gaze found Sarah against the wall, like a hawk spotting prey, "a woman dismissed from the Morrison household for immoral conduct." Tommy Mueller stepped forward, his young face flushed with anger. You talking about Miss Sarah?" Fletcher's expression turned predatory, cold as January wind. "Sarah Kellerman." "Yes. We understand she has been living in unsupervised proximity to unmarried men. The moral implications are deeply concerning to our investors." Big Mike O'Sullivan's hands clenched into fists the size of ham hocks. "Lady's done nothing but help every man in this camp. Help." Fletcher's voice dripped with innuendo, like honey from a broken comb. "I'm quite certain she has been very accommodating." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from burning garbage. Sarah's face flushed crimson as fresh blood. She stared at her worn boots, shoulders hunching under the weight of public shame. James's jaw tightened until muscles bulged beneath his beard. "Choose your words careful like. Mr. Fletcher." "I choose facts. Mr. Whitmore, Miss Kellerman was dismissed for seducing her employer's son. She has a documented history of inappropriate relations with men in positions of authority." "That's a bald-faced lie," Tommy shouted, his voice cracking. Fletcher ignored the boy, addressing James with the patience of a teacher correcting a slow student. "Your investors have instructed me to offer one final choice. Remove Miss Kellerman from these premises immediately, or face complete financial ruin. Every contract, every loan, every line of credit." The threat landed like a physical blow to James's gut. He felt his timber empire crumbling around him like a house built on sand. "How long do I have to decide? No decision required." Fletcher smiled, cold as a snake. "Miss Kellerman will accompany us back to Portland tonight. A carriage has been arranged for her transport." Sarah's knees buckled. She caught herself against the rough wooden wall, fingernails scraping splinters from the planks. Cookie stepped forward, flour still dusting his leather apron. "She ain't going nowhere with you vultures." Fletcher's smile widened, showing teeth yellow as old ivory. "I don't believe we solicited opinions from kitchen staff." The insult struck home like a slap across the face. Cookie's weathered features reddened, but his position as hired help left him powerless against Portland authority. Sarah straightened slowly, like an old woman rising from her deathbed, walked to James's notebook with steps that seemed to cause physical pain. Wrote with shaking hands, "I will go. Cannot destroy everything you worked to build." "Sarah." "No." James reached for her. She pulled away like his touch burned her skin. Wrote frantically, "They speak truth. I bring shame wherever I go. Better I leave before causing more ruin." Fletcher read over her shoulder, his voice oozing false sympathy. "Wise decision. Miss Kellerman, you show more sense than your employer." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She folded inward, shrinking like a flower touched by killing frost. Each cruel phrase stripped away another layer of the confidence she'd built during her weeks at the camp. Henderson stepped closer to Fletcher, close enough that the Portland man could smell chewing tobacco on his breath. "Mister, I seen plenty of low-down snakes in my time working timber. You're the lowest." "Your opinion carries no weight with me, Foreman. This camp exists solely at our discretion." Fletcher turned back to James, consulting a gold pocket watch that probably cost more than most men earned in a year. "Miss Kellerman will gather her belongings. We depart within the hour." Sarah nodded like a broken doll, her spirit crushed under the weight of public humiliation. She walked toward her quarters, each step heavier than the last, shoulders bowed as if carrying invisible chains. James watched her go, rage and helplessness warring in his chest like fighting cats. His business, his workers' livelihoods, everything balanced on this moment like a tree ready to fall. Fletcher and his companions retreated to their carriage to wait, satisfaction radiating from their well-fed faces. The camp erupted in angry voices that carried across the mountain air like war cries. "We can't let them take her. It ain't right. Miss Sarah never did nothing wrong to nobody." James raised his hand for silence, his voice heavy as a funeral bell. "Boys, I know how you feel. Lord knows I feel the same. But they hold all the contracts. Without their money, this camp closes down permanent. 200 jobs disappear like morning mist." Cookie's voice cracked with raw emotion. "So we just let them carrion birds carry her off." James had no answer. The arithmetic was brutal as an axe blade. Sarah's welfare measured against 200 livelihoods, and the numbers didn't balance. 20 minutes later, Sarah emerged from her quarters carrying the same worn carpet bag she'd brought from the train station. She'd changed into her original dress, faded, patched. The clothes of someone who owned nothing and expected less. She walked to James, handed him a folded piece of paper. Her eyes never met his, fixed on the ground like she was searching for her grave. James opened the note. "Thank you for showing me kindness. These weeks were the happiest of my life. Please don't think poorly of me. Sarah." His voice broke on her name like a stick snapping. She shook her head. Backing toward the waiting carriage, every step looked like it caused physical pain, like walking on broken glass. Tommy ran after her, tears streaming down his young face. "Miss Sarah, don't go. We'll fight them, all of us." Sarah touched Tommy's cheek with fingers gentle as butterfly wings, then signed a single word, "Goodbye." She climbed into the carriage without looking back. Fletcher slammed the door with finality. The driver cracked his whip, and the matched horses lurched forward. James watched the carriage disappear into darkness, taking Sarah back to a world that had already destroyed her once. The mountain silence pressed down like a burial shroud. Henderson put a weathered hand on James's shoulder. "Boss, this ain't over. Not by a long shot." "It is. Bill. They won. No." Cookie's voice carried surprising steel, cutting through the night air. "They ain't won nothing yet." The old cook walked to the center of the camp, cupped his hands around his mouth like a trumpet. "Listen up. Every man jack of you, Miss Sarah, just got dragged off by Portland jackals." Voices rose from every bunkhouse as men poured into the common area, boots pounding wooden planks. Cookie continued shouting, his voice carrying to every corner of the camp. "They want to play hardball with decent folks. Fine by me. No man in this camp cooks, cleans, or lifts so much as a finger until Miss Sarah comes home." "Strike!" Big Mike hollered, his voice echoing off the surrounding mountains. "Strike!" Tommy echoed, his young voice fierce as a war cry. "Strike!" The word thundered from 200 throats, shaking dust from the rafters. James stared at his crew in amazement. They were willing to sacrifice their wages, their jobs, everything for Sarah. Men who'd worked timber their entire lives, choosing principle over paychecks. Henderson grinned fierce as a wolf. "Boss, looks like your workers just made your decision for you." But James wasn't listening. He was calculating time and distance, his mind racing like a steam engine. Sarah's carriage would stop at Millfield Station to catch the evening train to Portland. If he rode hard on his fastest horse, he might catch them before the locomotive arrived. James ran toward the stables, Henderson close behind. "Saddle Thunder best horse we got." "Boss, what you planning to do?" "Something I should have done the minute those vultures showed their faces." James swung into the saddle, spurred Thunder into a gallop that sent gravel flying. Behind him, the camp erupted in organized chaos as 200 men began the first worker strike in Oregon Territory lumber history. The train whistle echoed through the valley as James rode, distant and mournful, getting closer with each passing minute. He was racing against time, against Portland money, against a system designed to crush people like Sarah under its wheels. Thunder's hooves pounded the dirt road like drumbeats. Trees flashed past in the darkness. The railway station's lights appeared ahead, yellow squares of warmth in the black night. James saw the carriage parked beside the platform. Fletcher stood near the ticket office, consulting his pocket watch with the satisfaction of a man who'd completed an unpleasant task. But the passenger bench sat empty. Sarah was gone. James dismounted Thunder in a spray of gravel and dust. Fletcher stood beside the empty passenger bench, his face twisted with confusion and rising anger. The smell of coal smoke hung heavy in the air from the approaching locomotive. "Where is she?" James demanded, his voice cutting through the night like an axe blade. Fletcher spun around, his steel-rimmed spectacles catching lamplight from the station platform. "She was here 5 minutes ago, sitting right there, docile as a lamb waiting for slaughter." The station master emerged from his office, a grizzled man with tobacco stains yellowing his gray whiskers. "You looking for the deaf lady?" "Yes. Where did she go?" The station master pointed toward the abandoned depot building, its broken windows dark as dead eyes. "Walked over there when she heard the train whistle growing louder. Been sitting in the old waiting room like a ghost haunting the place." James followed the direction of his gesture. Through shattered glass, he could see a small figure hunched on a bench inside the derelict building, motionless as carved stone. Sarah sat alone in the darkness, her carpet bag at her feet. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs that racked her thin frame. Fletcher pulled out his gold pocket watch, the chain glinting in the lamplight. "Train arrives in 12 minutes. We'll collect her then and be done with this unpleasant business." "No." The word came out harder than James intended, echoing off the station walls. "You won't." Fletcher's companion, a heavy-set man with a banker's soft hands and calculating eyes, stepped forward. "Mr. Whitmore, be reasonable. Your contracts represent your entire financial foundation. Can go straight to blazes." James walked toward the abandoned depot, each step feeling like shedding weight he'd carried for years. The weight of other people's approval, the weight of business calculations that reduced human beings to numbers on ledger pages. Sarah looked up as he approached, lamplight from the platform casting long shadows across her tear-streaked face. Even in the dim light, he could see the tracks of salt water on her cheeks. She pulled out her slate, wrote quickly with trembling fingers, "Go back to camp. Save your business. I'll manage somehow in Portland." James knelt in front of her on the splintered wooden floor, took the slate from her trembling hands. The chalk dust coating his fingers, wrote carefully, "Some things matter more than money." Sarah shook her head frantically, like a horse refusing the bit. Wrote, 200 men need wages. Cannot destroy their futures for my sake." James wrote, "They already voted. Every man on strike until you come home." Sarah stared at his words, her lips forming "strike" without sound. Eyes wide as saucers, James nodded, wrote Cookie's idea. "Entire camp shut down until you return. Not one man will work." Sarah's face crumpled like wet paper. She pressed her hands against her eyes, shoulders heaving with emotion she couldn't voice. The sound of the approaching train grew louder, its whistle cutting through the mountain air like a scream. James reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out something small he'd whittled during long winter evenings. A ring carved from cedar, rubbed smooth with beeswax until it gleamed like polished gold in the lamplight. He held it out to Sarah, the simple wooden band resting in his calloused palm. Her eyes widened like she'd been offered the crown jewels. She stared at the ring, then at James's face, then back at the ring. James wrote on the slate, "Marry me." Sarah's hands flew to her mouth, covering her lips. She shook her head, but not in refusal, in disbelief, like someone who'd been told they'd inherited a fortune. James wrote, "I love you, not because you need saving, because you saved all of us." Tears streamed down Sarah's face like spring snowmelt. She took the slate with shaking fingers. Wrote, "I have nothing to offer. No family, no reputation, no dowry money." James wrote, "You offer yourself. That's everything I need." The train rounded the bend, its headlamp cutting through darkness like a sword. Steam hissed as the engineer applied the brakes, sparks flying from the steel wheels. Sarah looked at the approaching locomotive, black smoke pouring from its stack. Then at James kneeling before her. Then at the simple wooden ring in his palm, carved with the patience of a man who worked with his hands. She reached out slowly, like touching a butterfly that might fly away. Her fingers brushed the carved cedar, feeling its warmth from his pocket. James wrote, "Will you have me?" Sarah picked up the ring, studied it in the lamplight. The wood was warm and smooth as river stone, carved with tiny flowers around the band forget-me-nots. He'd called them. She slipped it onto her finger. Perfect fit, like it had been made for her hand alone. Sarah's answer came in sign language, her hands moving with deliberate clarity. Yes. James didn't need translation. He pulled Sarah to her feet, drew her against his chest. She buried her face in his shoulder, her whole body trembling with relief and joy mixed together. The train screeched to a halt at the platform, belching steam that smelled of coal and hot metal. Fletcher strode toward them, his face purple with rage above his white collar. "Miss Kellerman, the train is here. You will board immediately, as agreed." Sarah turned in James's arms, her face transformed from the broken woman who'd sat on the depot bench weeks ago. Her spine straightened like a flagpole, her chin lifted with newfound courage. She stepped away from James, walked directly to Fletcher with purpose in every stride. Fletcher smiled triumphantly, thinking she'd changed her mind. Finally showing some sense. Sarah's open palm cracked across his face like a rifle shot. The slap echoed through the station like thunder. Fletcher staggered backward, his spectacles spinning to the platform with a tinkle of broken glass. Sarah's voice, unused for so long it came out hoarse as a crow's call. No. The single word carried the weight of years every time she'd been called shameful. Every time she'd been blamed for other people's sins. Every time she'd been told she deserved nothing but crumbs. All of it ended with that one word. Fletcher touched his reddening cheek, his mouth opening and closing like a fish drowning in air. You can't. Sarah turned to the banker, her voice clearer now. No. She faced the third Portland delegate. No. Her voice grew stronger with each repetition, not just refusing them, reclaiming herself from years of shame. The train conductor leaned out of his car, brass buttons gleaming on his blue uniform. "All aboard for Portland. Last call." Sarah walked to the conductor with steady steps. Not boarding. The conductor blinked, confused. Ma'am, I'm staying home. Fletcher found his voice, sputtering with indignation. This is preposterous. Your investors will... The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut him off like a knife through rope. Not one horse dozens, their hooves pounding the earth like war drums. James looked toward the timber road through the darkness. Lanterns bobbed in the night like fireflies, growing brighter as they approached. The sound grew louder. Horses, wagons, men's voices raised in song. The entire lumber camp appeared through the trees like an army marching to war. 200 men rode toward the station in torchlight procession. Cookie drove the supply wagon. Big Mike perched beside him, playing fiddle music that drifted through the night air. Tommy Mueller carried a hand-painted sign that read in bold letters, "Welcome home, Miss Sarah." Henderson led the column on his bay mare, grinning like he'd struck gold in a played-out claim. The procession surrounded the railway platform like water around a stone. Men dismounted, gathered in a circle around James and Sarah. Their faces glowed in the lamplight, proud, defiant, unified as soldiers under the same flag. Fletcher backed against the station wall like a cornered rat. This is highly irregular. You men should be working, earning your wages. Cookie climbed down from his wagon, joints creaking from years of hard labor. Work's finished when Miss Sarah's safe home. Big Mike tucked his fiddle under his massive arm. Besides, we got ourselves a wedding to plan, Fletcher's banker companion whispered urgently in his ear, pulling out an official document with legal seals. The banker shook his head like a man delivering bad news. Sir Mr. Whitmore, the banker announced, his voice carrying across the platform. By authority of the Portland Commercial Bank, your loans are called due immediately. Full payment required within 30 days, or we foreclose on all assets. The words hit James like a falling tree. His stomach dropped to his boots. 30 days to raise that kind of money, impossible as climbing the moon. Henderson stepped forward, his weathered face grim. How much money we talking about? The banker consulted his papers like a judge reading a death sentence. $47,000. A collective intake of breath from the assembled men, more money than most would see in 3 lifetimes of back-breaking labor. Tommy raised his hand like a schoolboy asking permission. I got $18 saved up. It's yours, boss. I got 42, added Jack Brennan, reaching for his wallet. 26 here, called another voice from the crowd. Cookie reached into his deep pockets, pulling out a leather pouch heavy with coins. Got $63. Been saving for a new cook stove, but this matters more than comfort. One by one, every man in the crowd pledged his savings. The amounts were small, $5 here, 10 there. Working men's modest nest eggs, saved penny by penny from meager wages. Henderson did quick arithmetic in his head, his lips moving as he calculated. Boys, we might scrape together 3,000 between all of us, not near enough to satisfy these vultures. Fletcher straightened his rumpled jacket, trying to recover his dignity. Precisely. Mr. Whitmore's romantic gesture has cost him everything he worked to build. The train whistle blew again, impatient as a creditor demanding payment. Final call for Portland. All aboard. Sarah walked to the train car, Fletcher smiling smugly as he thought she'd finally seen reason. Instead, Sarah pulled herself up onto the passenger platform with both hands. She turned to face the crowd, lamplight illuminating her slight figure against the dark train car like a portrait. Her hands began moving in sign language, flowing like water over stones. Every man understood her gestures now. Weeks of patient lessons had taught them her vocabulary. James translated automatically, his voice carrying over the crowd. She says we are her family now. Families don't abandon each other for money. Sarah's hands moved again, more emphatic. She says $47,000 is just paper and ink. What we've built together has real value. Big Mike wiped his eyes with his sleeve, unashamed of the tears. Lady speaks the truth. Sarah signed one final message, her movements deliberate as a preacher delivering a sermon. She asks, will you help us build something better than what Portland offers? The response thundered from 200 voices like cannon fire. Yes! Fletcher threw up his hands in disgust. This is complete madness. You're all mad as hatters. Sarah climbed down from the train, walked directly to the Portland delegation. Her voice, now steady and clear as church bells. Leave. You're not welcome on our land. Fletcher gathered his scattered dignity like picking up dropped coins. This isn't over. Whitmore, we'll be back with federal marshals and court orders. You do that, Henderson said quietly, his voice carrying the promise of violence. But you better bring plenty of men. The Portland delegation retreated to their carriage like beaten dogs. Fletcher's parting words carried venom. You'll regret this decision. Whitmore, all of you will pay for this foolishness. The carriage disappeared into darkness. Wheels rattling on the rocky road, the train pulled away empty, its whistle fading into the distance like a dying scream. James stood in the center of his crew, Sarah beside him. His timber business was ruined, his empire destroyed, 47,000 in debt with no way to pay. But 200 loyal workers surrounded them, men who'd chosen principle over paychecks, who'd stood up to Portland money and power. Sarah slipped her hand into his. The wooden ring caught lamplight, warm as a promise kept. Cookie cleared his throat, his voice thick with emotion. Boss, we got ourselves a wedding to plan. Cookie's right as rain, Henderson agreed, grinning fierce as a timber wolf. But first, we got business to discuss. James looked at his foreman with curiosity. What kind of business? Henderson's grin widened, showing gaps where teeth had been knocked out in timber camp fights. The kind where 200 men start their own lumber company, worker-owned, every man with a say. The crowd erupted in cheers that echoed off the surrounding mountains. Plans began immediately. Who had woodworking skills? Who understood machinery operation? Who could handle the bookkeeping? Sarah squeezed James's hand, her voice soft but sure. Our company. James looked around at the eager faces. These men who'd become more than employees. They were partners now. Family. Tommy raised his hand above the crowd. What do we call ourselves? Henderson considered, stroking his grizzled beard. How about Kellerman Whitmore Lumber Company? Sarah's face lit up like sunrise over the mountains. She signed her enthusiastic agreement, both hands moving in celebration. But as the celebration continued, none of them noticed the rider who'd been watching from the timberline. A man in expensive clothes, taking careful notes of everything he'd witnessed by lantern light. Harrison Fletcher's nephew, sent ahead to gather intelligence for the next phase of Portland's plan. The real war was just beginning. 3 days later, dawn broke over a camp, transformed like a town preparing for the county fair. Men who usually stumbled to work half awake moved with purpose, carrying pine planks and hammers instead of cross-cut saws and cant hooks, Cookie directed construction of the longest dining table Oregon Territory had ever seen, rough boards stretched between sawhorses, covered with every clean flour sack in camp. The makeshift tablecloth smelled of honest work and fresh bread. Big Mike supervised decorations, stringing pine boughs between fence posts until the entire common area looked like a mountain chapel. Sarah sat in her quarters, staring at the dress laid across her narrow cot like a prayer made manifest. 27 men had contributed to its creation, each adding skills learned in her evening sewing circles. Tommy Mueller had donated his mother's white organdy fabric, saved in his trunk for his own wedding someday. Jack Brennan's wife had sent lace from County Cork. Henderson contributed buttons carved from deer antler, smooth as river stones. Each stitch told a story written in calloused hands, Cookie's clumsy hemming along the bottom, Big Mike's surprisingly delicate work on the fitted bodice, Tommy's careful attention to sleeve cuffs that would frame her wrists. Men who'd learned needlework in lamplight had poured their new skills into creating something beautiful from scraps and kindness. Sarah touched the fabric with trembling fingers. No dress in Portland's finest shops could match this garment's true value, sewn with rough hands and generous hearts that had never failed her. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Tommy's voice carried through the wooden door. "Miss Sarah, Reverend Murphy's here from Salem. We're ready when you are." Sarah pulled the dress over her cotton chemise. The organdy whispered against her skin like butterfly wings. She fastened the deer antler buttons one by one, each one polished smooth by Henderson's patient hands. The Irish lace collar framed her throat perfectly, delicate as spider webs, but strong as the men who'd made this moment possible. She had no looking glass, but the dress felt right against her body, like wearing acceptance itself, woven from threads of belonging. Sarah opened her door. Tommy waited outside. Scrubbed clean and wearing his Sunday best, a black suit that had seen better decades, but gleamed with pride and careful brushing. "Miss Sarah." His voice cracked with emotion, still changing from boy to man. "You look..." Miss Sarah smiled, touched his smooth cheek gently. She signed, "Thank you, son." Tommy offered his arm like a true gentleman. "Ready to get yourself married?" The common area had filled with 200 men in their finest clothes, Sunday black mixed with work shirts pressed smooth with heated irons, clean faces above calloused hands that held their caps respectfully, hair slicked with pomade that smelled of bay leaves, and hope mixed with honest sweat. Reverend Murphy stood beneath an archway of Douglas fir boughs, his Bible bound in cracked leather that had seen decades of mountain services. A thin man with kind eyes behind wire spectacles. He'd ridden 20 miles through rough country to perform the ceremony. James waited at the altar's center, wearing Henderson's good jacket too large in the shoulders, too short in the sleeves. But his face glowed with happiness that made him handsomer than any store-bought suit could manage. The smell of pine resin and wood smoke clung to his clothes like incense. Sarah walked between rows of seated workers, faces she'd come to know through shared meals and evening lessons, men who'd defended her honor, sacrificed their savings, risked their futures for her sake. Each face told a story of transformation from rough timber workers to a family bound by something stronger than blood. Each step felt like coming home to a place she'd never been before. James took her hands when she reached him, his palms warm and steady against her trembling fingers. The wooden ring on her finger caught sunlight streaming through pine boughs like stained glass windows. Reverend Murphy opened his Bible, the leather binding creaking like saddle leather. "Dearly beloved, We are gathered here in the sight of the Almighty. His words washed over Sarah. In waves she felt more than heard. The vibration of his voice through the wooden platform, the rustle of pine boughs in mountain wind, the breathing of 200 men who'd become her family. James's hands anchored her to this moment, warm, steady, real as the mountains surrounding them. Do you, James Whitmore, take Sarah to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live? I do. James's voice carried across the assembled crowd like a bell ringing across water. Do you, Sarah Kellerman, take James to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live? Sarah's voice came clear and strong, practiced through weeks of evening conversations. I do. Reverend Murphy smiled, closing his Bible gently. By the authority vested in me by Oregon Territory and Almighty God, I now pronounce you husband and wife, James. You may kiss your bride. James leaned down, kissed Sarah gently. The touch lasted only seconds, but it sealed promises that would endure decades of mountain winters and summer heat. The crowd erupted like a dam bursting. 200 men cheered, whistled, stamped their boots against wooden planks until the sound echoed off surrounding mountains like thunder rolling through valleys. Cookie wiped his eyes with his flour-dusted sleeve. 30 years cooking for timber crews. Never thought I'd cry at a wedding. Big Mike pulled out his fiddle, bow dancing across strings. Time for proper music. The feast began immediate-like. Cookie had coordinated contributions from every man's homeland Irish stew that smelled of home, German sausages spiced with memories, Italian bread baked in Dutch ovens, Polish pierogi stuffed with potatoes and dreams. Aromas mixed in the mountain air like incense from a dozen churches. Sarah moved between tables, accepting congratulations in languages she couldn't understand but felt in her heart. Men who could barely scratch their own names had composed marriage wishes in careful script. Rough hands pressed small gifts into hers, whittled animals, pressed wildflowers, handkerchiefs sewn with clumsy stitches but infinite care. As evening approached and shadows lengthened across the camp, Big Mike climbed onto a table. His fiddle sang across the camp a gentle waltz that spoke of home and belonging. Melody floating through pine-scented air. James extended his hand to Sarah, his palm warm and slightly rough from years of honest work. She took it. Let him lead her to the cleared space between dining tables where sawdust had been swept clean. They began to dance on wooden planks worn smooth by countless boots. Sarah couldn't hear the music, but she felt its rhythm through James's movements. His steps guided hers in perfect synchronization, their bodies moving together like they'd been dancing for years. Around them, 200 grown men watched with tears streaming down weathered faces, unashamed of the emotion that filled their hearts. The dance lasted 3 songs, though Sarah counted heartbeats instead of measures. When it ended, absolute silence filled the camp like snow falling on water. Then applause thundered again, lasting until hands grew sore from clapping and voices hoarse from cheering. Henderson raised a tin cup of apple cider, the evening light catching the liquid like liquid gold. To Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, the Whitmores, The toast echoed from every throat, voices harmonizing in languages learned across oceans, but unified by shared experience. Sarah signed to the crowd, her hands moving with deliberate grace. James translated, his voice carrying to every corner of the gathering. She says we are all family now. Blood doesn't make family choice, does? Big Mike struck up another tune, fiddle joined by mouth harps and Henderson's surprisingly melodious voice. Men began singing voices harmonizing in German, Irish, Italian, languages from the old country, but singing of this new place they'd made together. The celebration continued past midnight, fueled by music and fellowship that needed no alcohol to warm hearts. Stories were told, memories shared, plans made for their new lumber company. Dreams took shape through fair discussion. Every worker would own shares. Every voice would be heard in decisions. As the evening wound down like a clock, spring releasing, James and Sarah slipped away to his cabin, now theirs, inside. Sarah had arranged her few possessions beside his like pieces of a puzzle finally fitting together. Her sewing basket, with its neat compartments, the slate where she'd first written her name, the McGuffey reader Tommy had given her, pages worn soft from evening study. James lit the whale oil lamp, glass chimney throwing steady light across wooden walls chinked with moss and clay. Sarah sat on the bed's edge, still wearing her wedding dress that caught lamplight like captured moonbeams. She pulled out her slate, wrote, "Happy." James sat beside her on the quilt his mother had sewn decades ago, wrote, "Complete." Sarah leaned against his shoulder, solid and warm as sunlight on stone. For the first time in years, silence felt peaceful instead of isolating. Outside, the last voices faded as men returned to their bunkhouses, boots echoing on wooden planks. 5 years passed like seasons changing, each one bringing new growth to their mountain community. The Kellerman Whitmore Lumber Company thrived beyond anyone's wildest dreams. Their reputation spread throughout Oregon Territory and beyond the timber operation, where workers were treated with dignity, where innovation flourished like wildflowers after rain, where every person's contribution mattered regardless of their differences. Portland's threats never came to pass. Other investors, impressed by the company's success and worker loyalty, provided backing when word spread of their fair dealings. The camp expanded like a town finding its feet, built a one-room schoolhouse, established a medical clinic where Sarah taught basic first aid to anyone who wanted to learn. Sarah and James's children, 3 of them now, 2 boys and a girl, grew up speaking both English and American Sign Language as naturally as breathing. The entire camp learned signs, making it the most welcoming community in the territory for folks who were different. Tommy Mueller, now foreman with shoulders broad as his father's, had married a school teacher from Salem who taught hearing children and deaf children together. Cookie ran the camp store in addition to cooking, his prices fair and his heart generous. Big Mike led the community band that performed at regional gatherings, fiddle music drawing crowds from miles around. Henderson, promoted to general manager, kept the company's fair dealings strong as iron. Every major decision required worker approval. Profits were shared based on contribution, not position. No one was dismissed for disability or difference. Instead, they found ways to use every person's particular gifts. The abandoned Millfield station had been converted into a training center for deaf workers from across the territory. Sarah taught classes in practical skills and communication, her students carrying her philosophy of human dignity to new communities like seeds on the wind. On their 5th wedding anniversary, James and Sarah returned to the depot where they'd first met. A bronze plaque now marked the spot, green with honest weather, but words still clear. Here. In 1883, James Whitmore discovered Sarah Kellerman and learned that true wealth comes from recognizing the worth in every human soul. Their marriage founded Oregon Territory's first worker-owned lumber company and established new standards for treating all people with dignity and respect. Sarah traced the words with her finger, feeling each letter carved deep in metal. She signed to James. "Did we really change so much?" James looked back toward their thriving community. Children played in the schoolyard, their laughter mixing with the sound of saws and hammers. Workers discussed the day's tasks as equals, not servants. The medical clinic served anyone who needed care. Payment based on ability rather than requirements. "We didn't change anything that wasn't already true," he signed back, his hands now as fluent as hers. "We just remembered what decent folks should have known all along." Sarah smiled, pulling out a letter that had arrived that morning, an invitation from the territorial legislature. They wanted her to speak about employment practices for people with disabilities, her reputation having spread far beyond their mountain valley. Her voice, now strong from years of use and confidence, carried across the quiet depot, ready for our next adventure. James took her hand. The wooden ring worn smooth as silk by 5 years of honest work and faithful love. Around them, the sound of children's laughter drifted from the direction of home, their eldest son racing toward them, signing excitedly about a fort he'd built with friends who spoke with hands and voices equally. "Always," he said, and meant it, as they walked back toward camp. The bronze plaque caught afternoon sunlight like a promise kept. The words would endure long after James and Sarah returned to mountain soil. Testimony to what 2 ordinary people could accomplish when they chose to see worth where others saw only difference. The camp whistle blew in the distance, calling workers home for supper. The sound echoed through the valley, no longer harsh, but welcoming a call to community, to belonging, to the place where everyone had value. Their story had become something larger than themselves, but more importantly, it had become daily truth lived by hundreds of people who'd learned that every soul deserves dignity, respect, and the chance to contribute their gifts to the world. The silent promise had been kept, echoing through generations yet to come. I'll be honest with you, when I first came across James and Sarah's story, I thought it was too good to be true. A wealthy lumberjack who chooses love over profit. A deaf woman who transforms an entire workforce through simple human kindness. It sounded like something from a Sunday sermon. But then I realized something that made my heart ache. We live in a world where differences divide us, where people get cast aside for not fitting society's narrow notions of valuable. James and Sarah's tale reminds us that real strength comes from seeing worth in folks others have written off. Their lumber camp became legendary not because it was perfect, but because it proved something we'd forgotten, that treating people with dignity actually works, that communities flourish when everyone's gifts get valued. Maybe their story challenges us to ask uncomfortable questions. Who have we written off in our own lives? What voices aren't we hearing? How might our communities change if we chose connection over convenience, if we saw potential instead of problems? This work is inspired by frontier stories and created solely for entertainment purposes. It does not condone any form of violence or harmful behavior. All characters and events are products of imagination, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.